Hi again. In The Rise of Adventism, Edwin Scott Gaustad, editor, we're in the chapter on spiritualism. Its immense impact upon the middle of 19th century America. And Lawrence Moore of Cornell University is addressing the various forms and the variety of spiritualism during this period. And he makes this point next, that while, however, the leading spiritualist publications and the most prominent advocates of a spiritualist religion did not try to fashion a detailed creed, they made their liberal theological biases obvious enough. Showing their debt to Universalists, Unitarians, and Transcendentalists, and often pressing beyond them, they demanded a simplification of faith. They either declared their independence from biblical authority or made the authenticity of Christian scriptures dependent on the reality of modern spirit voices. Robert Dale Owen, who like his father became both an ardent reformer and an ardent spiritualist, argued that the materialization of 19th century spirits gave new credibility to biblical stories about the miracles of Jesus. Epes Sargent praised the work of mediums for its proof that inspiration from the spiritual realm was not a past miracle, but a continuing fact. From Emerson and from the Swedenborgians, among other sources, proponents of a spiritualist religion learned to collapse the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and to identify correspondences between things in the seen and the unseen worlds. The particular handling of this notion in many spiritualist writings opened spiritualists to the charge of teaching a gross materialism, but it was important to their expanded and democratized view of revelation. The naturalness of everything allowed everyone to read religious truths everywhere. Since God was eternally and everywhere in nature, special revelation was really unnecessary. Thus, according to S.B. Brittan, the supreme life and thought flow into and animate the immeasurable realms of being, and deity is incarnated in the grand and beautiful forms of his creation. End of quote from Brittan. Dr. A.B. Child of Boston, who was never at a loss to sum up his conception of the religious importance of spiritualism, wrote, quote, "We will call the great volume of nature our Bible, in which we find the record that we call the Word of God. On every gigantic leaf of nature's book, God's own finger has written in indelible lines, every word of which is unalterable truth." End of quote. These were particularly comforting views in light of the troublesome confusion of messages received through mediums. The Transcendentalist teaching that deity dwelled and was most conspicuously revealed within each human soul also influenced many spiritualistic writings. To be sure, many believers in spirits were uncomfortable with the idea of intuitively derived truth and spoke as if certain knowledge about immortality came solely from the external spirit manifestations visible or audible at seances. However, Transcendentalist phrasing was sufficiently common in spiritualist lectures to allow Christian ministers to stigmatize spiritualism as a confused and especially misleading version of pantheism. They could cite directly from the Banner of Light the statement that God is not a person but a principle permeating all things. Or they could turn to an address by F.L. Wadsworth, typical of many delivered before spiritualist audiences. Quote, "Nothing is outside of God, and God is not outside of anything. Every particle that exists, every human soul, possesses within itself that which is absolutely and essentially divine." End of quote. While reaching no agreement about the nature of God, and often showing an aversion to bringing God into their discussions at all, spiritualist leaders did tend to reject any religious doctrine centered on a God who could be separated from nature. They could not understand the logic of worshiping God as a personality who had made the world and planned its destiny, or distinguish such a view from anthropomorphic superstitions prevalent, they thought, among people who still lived in trees. Quote, "A belief in a personal God as above nature is the cause of all error," unquote. That is the way one spiritualist writer summed up the case against Christianity, before proceeding to pursue his own pantheistic views into a frank atheism. To talk about a God who existed before all other life and was radically separate from all other substance would have permitted the forbidden distinction between natural and supernatural. God and whatever it was into which he first infused himself as a principle of life were co-eternal and finally undistinguishable. Virtually all shades of spiritualist opinion rejected special providences and miracles. Nature and all realms of the visible and invisible worlds operated in an orderly way. Everything was in some sense one and harmonious. The universe, though infinitely complex, is one, and a mutual dependence and reciprocal action characterize all gradations of being. That's a direct quote from one of the spiritualist publications of the day. The pantheistic emphasis of spiritualist writing in the 19th century did have a twist uncharacteristic of most other religions based on a monistic conception of reality, although that twist was certainly consistent with much of the Christian writing in America at the same time. Spiritualists combined their belief in a divine principle which flowed through and connected all nature with a firm insistence on the uniqueness of the individual soul before and after death. Most religious expressions containing elements of pantheism, for example Hinduism and certain forms of Christian mysticism, assume that after death, if salvation is attained, the individual soul merges into a cosmic oneness. At the very least, they de-emphasize individual personality and depict as the crucial sensation of salvation the soul's overwhelming feeling of relatedness to the whole. In the case of spiritualism, matters stood quite differently. The spirits who delivered messages to Judge Edmonds were certain about continued individuality. Quote, "You will never lose your identity. If God designed to absorb all souls into himself, there would have been no necessity at first to give off from himself distinct identical germs possessing all the characteristics of independence." End of quote. No other American religion in the 19th century had more concrete and individualized notions of the afterlife. Spirits retained all the discrete characteristics of their earthly personalities. Their astral bodies looked very much like their earthly bodies. Spirit babies grew up into men and women as they would have done on earth. The spirit realms presented landscapes very similar to those on earth. Not only could the distance of spirit realms from the earth be calculated, but their scenery, social organization, and government could be described down to the last detail. In the distance, according to one spirit speaking from the third sphere, were seen numerous mountains dipping their lofty ridges in the crescent splendor of a celestial sun, while the music of the waterfall was heard sweetly blending its voiceful eloquence with the harmonial carolings of, I don't even know this word, paradisiacal songsters. That might be paradisiacal, but if it is, it's misspelled. The flowers wafted forth a fragrance belonging alone to heaven, while the gorgeous tinted butterfly flitted from one to the other, sipping the celestial sweetness which sparkled like morning dews on each perfumed petal. End of quote. The splendor promised by such messages contained the comforting assurance that the departing spirit, launching itself into the next world, say from Kansas, would be leaving behind a good bit that was drab, but not all that was familiar. So I'll put in a link to a series we did on hell and the afterlife. The first one is in general a refutation of the assumption of the Jehovah's Witnesses that the dead are non-existent. Are they non-existent or asleep? And then there's a couple of follow-ups to that about the specific words hell and Gehenna. Just look for the links at the end of the first video.